At the time of recording, it's been 2 weeks since the release of Clair Obscur Expedition 33, a game that, for a number of reasons, has been met with sudden and immediate acclaim. Firstly, for many players it seems to have appeared out of nowhere. Apparently one of the few shortcomings of not being a AAA title is a lack of a marketing push, and instead there has been a trickle of articles, YouTube videos in the build-up to its release, a muted, albeit notable voice cast announcement just before Christmas, and perhaps, most effectively, a word of mouth among RPG communities in particular, creating an awareness of this upcoming game. Looking today, we are seeing the game hitting the front page of the BBC News website, President Emmanuel Macron praising it, and a myriad of articles lauding this unexpected success, celebrating that a small contingent of gamers, developers, writers combined to create this refreshing game experience, not entirely dissimilar, I think, to the celebrated release of Disco Elysium some years ago, which was likewise developed by a commune of tabletop literary types under the stewardship of Robert Kurwitz. In some respects, I think the success of Expedition 33 is quite telling of the state of the games industry today, and how these sorts of startup hits have become the unexpected exception rather than the rule. Because gaming is an industry that was built on startups and experimentation. Small collectives or individual programmers in their bedrooms in the 1980s publishing titles and hacking systems like the Atari and the Commodore to get games made. And this was later liberated by the advent of the Sony PlayStation, who, unlike its competitors, was very third-party friendly in the mid-1990s, resulting in one of the most creative console generations in history. The big money Hollywood-style behemoth that the industry had become by the 2010s largely remains the state of play today, with the likes of COD, Assassin's Creed and GTA being the Marvel movie equivalences, monopolising studio bandwidth and the advertising we see out in the world. And despite the advent of Steam and smaller companies trying to make headway, this is the state of play, and it's something that's criticised by some, defended as a necessary response to modern technology and development cycles by others, and yet Expedition 33 seems to counter the notion that big budgets and big teams and big studios are the necessity for creating quality games in the modern era. And even accounting for the efficiency of game engine tools, libraries, and these things that Sandfall seem to have attributed to the quick turnaround time and the game's quality, it is still quite remarkable that a game of Expedition 33's caliber was turned around by such a comparatively small team in a comparatively small time frame when compared to big-ticket AAA games we see on the market elsewhere. Turning to the game itself, it was touted as something inspired by latter 1990s era Final Fantasy games. Early screenshots nodded to a Persona-style battle system, and actually playing the game, there is also a surprising Dark Souls, Elden Ring sort of vibe about it too, which is slightly more forgiving, thankfully, marginally less abstract in tone and narrative clarity. And so it's great for players like me who always liked the idea of Dark Souls more than I actually liked playing them. Looking more broadly at the game's influences, other comparisons have been drawn from things like Paper Mario, Xenogears. A lot of players have sort of speculated on Expedition 33 and recalled games that they personally remember. But ultimately, I think it is a boon to those inclined towards JRPGs, Japanese studio titles, and personally I have really enjoyed how they have folded in celebrated aspects of the JRPG genre, such as unique levelling and combat systems, the Fellowship quest, and folded them in with Western sensibilities and Western style storytelling, which is quite a sweeping statement. But for example, the game doesn't shy away from having protagonists in the 30+ age bracket, represented as fit and able to lead a story, which is in stark contrast to many JRPGs where 35 is often a comically geriatric age, whether that's Persona, Final Fantasy, Fantasian. We often have high school age characters leading in what is often that paint-by-numbers coming-of-age tale. As good as these games otherwise are, they very much appeal to this shonen demographic, I think. And this is not necessarily a criticism, and I think a lot of it relates to demographics and cultural differences with Japan. They have a much more definitive break between youth and adulthood, which is often represented in their media. But regardless, it is evident that Expedition 33 is a game made by people who have grown up and matured alongside their childhood game experiences and produced something that reflects that, while JRPGs in many respects often don't, and they deal instead with this certain demographic more consistently. I've touched on the battle system and levelling, and I'm sure I'll go into much more detail in these in future episodes if I cover Expedition 33 further, which I think I might. Initially I was confused when reading up about the game prior to release about how they would square the circle of reactive gameplay and turn-based gameplay. And the execution of the button presses for additional buffs or defense or evasion in battle is actually a pretty interesting framework for the game. It has proven a turn-off for some players who deemed it slow or complex. They either seem to want a pure turn-based ATB style or a pure action style. Yet the reactive gameplay is certainly innovative, certainly interesting, and it's definitely a learning curve that I warmed up to quite quickly. And the game's complexity is as much determined by working out an enemy's attack patterns as it is with levelling and strength aspects too. So instinctively, I quite enjoyed that. The game's world map was also something I immediately warmed to, which throws back again to the minified worlds of 90s era JRPGs like Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest. We have a balance of exploration, world building through this illusion of scope and scale, and increasingly traversable parts of the world, which, as I say, they recall the best elements of JRPGs without overly aping them or imitating them. And this, I think, is ultimately why Expedition 33 succeeds so well. It has an aesthetic, a set of mechanics, and a narrative framework that appeals to this nostalgic love of JRPGs, and Final Fantasy in particular, without being an obvious homage or direct imitation of them. It is very much its own game, its own universe and set of conventions that has drawn on the childhood inspiration of its creators. And while I recently discussed the prospect of Final Fantasy XVII and whether emerging Square directors today will be influenced directly by the likes of 1997's Final Fantasy VII, as compared to company veterans who were inspired by Final Fantasies 1, 2 and 3, it's amusing to me how the emergence of Sandfall and this debut title has in some ways beaten Square Enix to the punch, shown perhaps a certain dynamism and willingness to experiment with traditional JRPG mechanics that is much harder to justify, and there's less willingness in large AAA companies. So it's a fascinating game, and more so a fascinating release. I had a feeling that I would love it, and I do, but I did not expect 2 million sales in a 2-week period or anything like that. It is much more than a little curio for JRPG veterans to enjoy, which I thought was going to be the case, and it has clearly elicited and spoken to a broader appeal and desire from a huge number of players to try something a little bit different, whether that's the story, the aesthetic, or the particular approach to gameplay. So, as I say, I may well do some future episodes delving a little more into Expedition 33, story mechanics, so on. But suffice to say, I've really enjoyed this game, and I think it is up there among my favourites, certainly of this console generation. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.